låt allt sånt låneutbildning innan han sen sa det och John Lenson audition och John Huxley och John Huxley och John Huxley John Huxley amen.
I'm Elise Agar Wittine, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all here. It's sort of like Old Home Week. I think it's just important to note that years ago, it was at Harvard where Tim Leary and Ram Dass, and who was then Richard Alpert, were professors, and Andy Weil was an undergraduate student. Ralph Matzner was a graduate student. And now, a generation later, Rick is back at Harvard and has founded MAPS. So I'll let him tell you about the rest.
What I think most of us share is a need to find some way to integrate the experiences that we've either read about or had ourselves into our culture. And I think we stand at a crossroads, which is why this was the time that this benefit was organized, because we have now an increasing knowledge base, both physiological about the relative safeties of the drugs such as LSD, MDMA. We have an enormous knowledge base, which was what this first panel is about other cultures. And it seems that there is an increasing need for people to connect to experiences of wholeness, experiences of healing. And by having all of this driven underground, the way the war on drugs is tending to do, I think that we really are harming ourselves more so than helping ourselves.
I do think it is always worth coming together as part of our family and maintaining the light during these dark ages. But I think it is important to realize that the climate beyond this room is incredibly hostile to these substances, which are still, by most Americans, put in the same category with heroin, as seen as being extremely dangerous medically, psychologically, and in some ways accurately perceived as being threats to society and the values of conventional society. You know, and that's just how it is. When in my undergraduate time at Harvard, I had the good fortune to stumble into the Harvard Botanical Museum and the domain of Richard Evans Schultes, which is where I spent most of my time as an undergraduate. And through that association, became very interested in the use of plants, especially medicinal and psychoactive plants in other cultures, and had the chance to do a lot of work with Indian cultures, mostly in South America, and looking at their uses of plants. At the same time, I had a great personal interest in personal exploration, and I'd say the two paths that really moved me in this direction were first personal experiments with mescaline to see what I could learn from that, and then secondly, professional and academic interest in these native uses of plants and other cultures, which resonated with a long-standing interest that goes back as far as I can remember with plants and delight in growing plants and using them. The time that I spent in South America, and through the botanical studies as well, convinced me that plants that alter consciousness have always been held in very special regard by human beings. And just to give you one idea of how important they have been in human culture, I find it very interesting that all of the major drug plants, marijuana, opium poppies, coca leaves, with all of these, we do not know the botanical history of them because we cannot find examples of truly wild forms of these plants. One way that botanists discover how plants evolved is to find what they call wild populations. Wild, as used by botanists, does not mean the way we use it normally. Most of what we call wild plants are plants that have escaped from human cultivation. Truly wild plants in the botanical sense mean that they have never had any human influence. In the case of these major drug plants, they have been domesticated for so long that wild populations have disappeared or can't be identified. In fact, the evidence suggests that these are the first plants that human beings domesticated, before food plants. And that, to me, that botanical fact says really all you need to know about human involvement with substances that change consciousness and what an important role they have played in human society and human life. I have written extensively and talked extensively about what I see as a great mistake that our culture has made in identifying plants in nature that have interesting effects on us, whether on our minds or bodies or both, and then trying to identify and isolate the single chemical compounds that are most responsible for those effects and make them available in pure form or synthetic form or with molecular variations of them that are even more powerful in their effects, and then making these available to people. That seems to me to be a great mistake, that it opens the door to a lot of trouble. These pure chemicals in refined form that can be introduced into the bloodstream and brain in much more direct ways than swallowing them cause much greater toxicity. They have a much higher association with addiction. They cause us a lot more trouble. One of the great differences between traditional cultures that use psychoactive substances and us is their sense of respect for the plant as a whole. They may play with that plant, change its mechanical form, prepare it in ways that make it easier to take or enhance its effect, but they don't tamper with the constituents of it. And they don't take single elements out and refine those and make them available in pure form. That's one of the ways that they reduce the chance that these substances will cause trouble in their life.
Through the years, through the centuries, the Native American church, we used this holy herb. It goes back way back into history. It keeps a family together. And through the teaching of the Native American church, we try to keep the family together, the roots, where we come from. And I think if this was practiced in American society, I think the people would be better off. I think they would have respect for their being and their children and where they come from, their roots. A lot of times people don't know where they're coming from. They're just people. They don't care about one another. They're just out for themselves. And I think that the more of this, it's gonna ruin, the world. And that's how we use this holy herb, the peyote. And to me, it's good. It brings us good teaching. It brings us good teaching. And that's why, I don't call it a drug, because it makes me understand all these elements, So we have a lot of respect for nature. And because we live and we're part of nature. A lot of people, they say that the Indian people, they pray to the fire or to the water. No. We're praying with it, as an object, because we're part of that. That's the way, the Holy Spirit put us here. So I wanted to tell you, how we use this Native American church, the Holy Sacrament.
Reality is multiple and plural and very much a function of our own internal attitudes, our own internal intentions, motives and perceptions and belief systems that we bring to it. So it's appropriate for us to adopt an attitude of humility, to learn from those peoples that have preserved ways of life in which nature, animals, plants are treated with respect. It's appropriate for us to be in an attitude of respect and humility towards nature itself, for us to walk in the woods, for us to really think about what kind of food we eat and how we eat the food and what we do with the animals that we farm and that we herd and that we have domesticated for our own purposes. And to really look at whether some of the things that we do are things that we really need or things that we've been conditioned to or been addicted to, pursue, we've been sold and we've been conditioned and brainwashed, if I might use that term, to accept this mirage, this ideal of ever-increasing progress, meaning more and more of more and more things to consume. What for? And we look around and our waters are polluted, our air is poisoned, the soil is depleted and devitalized, and the food is no longer nourishing. And people are killing each other and extinguishing species. The diversity of life is being reduced at an alarming rate. At a rate at which it continues will mean that in a few 25 years we will live in a world that is abysmally impoverished in the beauty and the variety and the tremendous diversity. Not only because some of these diverse plants might prove to contain drugs that will help us cure cancer, because they have value and beauty and they are due our respect for themselves. Who are we to say that we have a right to impose our human way? This is what's called the arrogance of humanism. The arrogance of humanism, which is leading us to the brink of destroying our world. So I see the use of these certain species of plants that seem to have this very strange and very interesting and profound kind of almost symbiotic relationship to the human species, where they can function to us as teachers. They have an intelligence. And the animal species have an intelligence. The shamanic cultures have told us that before. And I've had the privilege and honor to participate in ceremonies conducted by native people or people who have been trained or studied these ways where these such of plants are used in a sacramental way and in a healing way, and have seen people describe about their experiences. I've seen people describe experiences of reconnecting with deep parts within themselves that were yet also a reconnection with the nature around us, with the world of animals, the spirits of animals, the spirits of plants, plants as teachers, and the world of the elements, the air, the fire, the water, the earth herself. So it's a revival of shamanism. It's a revival of interest in the old religion, the old pre-Christian traditions that European civilization had, where it had a lot of knowledge of a large variety of psychoactive and medicinal and nutritious herbs, much of which has been completely lost, and the knowledge preserved by indigenous cultures in other parts of the world. And a return to an animistic vision where nature is seen and acknowledged and recognized as being alive in all its ways. And then the events that happened in 1989, the last half of the year, last quarter of the year in Eastern Europe, and then subsequently in South Africa and so forth, and in Russia, particularly have actually changed my thinking and have changed my feeling about it and basically, what I learned from that is that I shouldn't exclude from my thinking the possibility of the unexpected making really very, very profound changes. The kinds of changes that are taking place now. Maybe that's enough. Thank you.
Well, it's a pleasure to see the tribe assembled. You know, when we look at our own psychedelic experience, it seems so personally huge that it's very hard to place it in the context of hundreds of thousands of such experiences. But when we do that, when we look at the medical research that was carried on until it was suppressed some 20 years ago, the feeling that you come away with is psychedelics dissolve boundaries. This is what they do. They dissolve boundaries at every level. They dissolve boundaries between the conscious mind and the unconscious mind, between men and women, between various societies and points of view. And at one time, I was willing to let it rest at that, to imagine, well, these things are boundary dissolving, structure dissolving compounds, and this is what gives them their enormous import, because they lead us outside of the theater of language and into the real world that we suppressed in the process of becoming acculturated to our own culture. But now I've thought more deeply about this, and I think we can say more about this phenomenon of boundary dissolution, because the most profound boundary that any of us experience is the boundary between ego and world. We are in the world, but we are the ego. This is the cultural myth in which we live, and this is the cultural myth that is completely dissolved, exploded, and blown away by the psychedelic experience. It is not a cliche to say that it is an experience of oneness, because the world we are living in is unifying itself at a prodigious rate. And this is not the will of institutions. Andy made reference to what a con this drug war is, because it's making so much money for so many people. The chief function of institutions appears to be to retard progress and to keep their criminal enterprises bubbling merrily along on the side. Meanwhile, the rest of us, the masses of people struggling to come to terms with the end of history, can see, can feel that what we need is a sense of unity, not an idea of unity, not an ideology of unity, because if there ever was an ideology of unity, it was communism, and the pieces are still falling from the explosion of that system of thought. We need a feeling of unity. Feeling is primary. So it doesn't come out of intellectual exhortation. It comes out of a personal act of courage made by the individual, an act of courage which involves surrender. Surrender is the opposite side of the coin of ego. The central issue of our times is our inability to surrender to what we know is right. We have the ability to feed the hungry. We have the ability to educate our children, to clean up our environment, to eliminate sexism, to eliminate racism. The question is, can we change our minds fast enough? Not can we change our minds, but can we change them fast enough? The momentum of the institutions that were created out of the collapse of medieval society has become so great, the momentum toward a lethal conclusion, that if we don't act quickly to pull ourselves out of this power dive, eventually the political will, the resources, even the infrastructure will not be there to support this kind of a reorienting of our thinking. I believe in psychedelics because I've seen them work. That's the main thing. They are operationally effective. Psychoanalysis, yoga, this is all very fine if you have worlds enough and time, but we don't. If you stake your self-identity on the aggrandizement of a single atom of humanity, which you call yourself, then what hope is there for creating a coherent communal future? None, I submit, and I believe that's the position that we are in. We need a radical intervention in the evolution of our social psychology. And we have the models. This is one thing that puts us a leg up over the 1960s. They didn't realize, not enough people realized, that this was not something new. This was something old. That shamanism, psychedelic shamanism, is how religion was practiced for the first million years. And if there is to be any future for our species, it's how it's going to be practiced from here on out. We have to overcome male dominance, institutional dominance, suppression of the feminine, suppression of females, worship of technology. All of these things arise out of a projection of energy away from the authentic toward the ephemeral, toward the fleeting. You know, it's all flowing anyway. There's somebody here who said, be here now. This notion that the quality, the primacy of experience is the centerpiece of being. Not regret, not plans, not projections, but the primacy of the felt experience of the moment. If we stick with that, we not only gain a kind of authenticity for ourselves, but we open a space for dialogue where the frightened, the truly ego-sick, the institutional junkies, the truly traumatized can then feel, well, here is an area where perhaps I can feel safe. Here is an area where I can perhaps take a chance on changing my mind. And this is not an exhortation to a political movement. The mind that it is most important to change is our own, each of us, by ourselves. So I think, it's wonderful that psychedelic use is spreading, because each person who is touched by it is brought back into the authentic community of being. But it's also very important that we who are psychedelic remain psychedelic, deepen the psychedelic commitment, and carry it forward, because after all, we're the yeast that could make the bread rise. And then there would be bread for everyone. Thank you. We need a radical intervention in the evolution of our social psychology. And we have the models.
Could we be here, or would we be here in this moment of exaltation and sense of positive growth if we had not had in the last 6 months probably the 6 most glorious months in human history? I'm talking, of course, about the events. I mean, we all feel it. And I know when you saw the video shots coming from Tiananmen Square, and you saw 100,000, 300,000, 1 million young Chinese students, and you saw that look in their eye, that Woodstock gleam, And you saw them with the headbands and the V sign. And they had the old Abby Hoffman trick. They learned it for television. They knew how to play the cameras. They were throwing the flowers at the tanks and saying, "Soldiers, we love you." I mean, and then, of course, the Berlin Wall coming down. The last, Ramdas and I had a wonderful Christmas phone call, and we both shared our joy that in a small way, and in a sense a larger way, everything we've been doing was part of the evolution of youth, the new breed that brought that wall down, because it was individual freedom. I personally would give giving out Academy Oscars for who brought the wall down. I would name 3 wonderful prophets of our time that influenced me and that I was fortunate enough to meet. The first of all, of course, was Benjamin Spock. Benjamin Spock taught quantum psychology, and he said to the parents, "Treat your kids as individuals." I mean, that's the most powerful statement that's ever been made, preparing us for the information age when you got to climb into your brain. And there's only one person can run a brain, and that's the individual. The second person, who is not an American, is a Swiss gentleman and also a doctor. Dr. Spock and Dr. Hoffman. I mean, although he's one of the great organic chemists of our time, we all know that he was a very deeply cultured man with a deep roots in the tradition of German and Swiss and European mysticism, so that he just didn't happen to ride that funny bicycle home that day and think it was a psychiatric episode. I mean, he'd seen the guidebooks. He knew what was going on. And a third, who's the third person I'm going to mention? A third doctor. Marshall McLuhan. Because, number one, Marshall McLuhan was always a strong supporter of the psychedelic movement in this country in the 60s. He actually told me, it was his, I get the credit, it was his script by him. He told me the words that turn out, to be the American translation of Glasnost and Perestroika. He said, "Timothy, tell him, turn on, tune in, and drop out." Think about it. Now, it's no news to you there's a war on drugs out there. In the history of religious insanity and holy wars, I think this one takes the cake. I mean, the absolute... we knew at Harvard after about a year that we were going to have a little trouble with... there was a taboo against the brain. You're not supposed to tamper with the brain in an industrial society, and we found that out right away. And there were many times after a while we'd sit around and we'd say, well, these psychedelic drugs are psychotomimetic. They create serious mental confusion, paranoia, hysterical hallucinations in deans and government officials who have not taken it. One thing that's true, of course, in a war, there's no more, it's all propaganda. And the one weapon we have, and we're going to talk about what's going to happen. By the way, my script is very positive. I mean, evolution didn't work for 2 billion years to create the human brain with its wonderful receptor sites to let people like Czar Bennett and his ilk stop it all. Each of us in our own ways have to follow Orwell's basic prescription. In times of big brother insanity, your first job is to remain sane yourself. And number 2, look around and you'll find there are a lot of people with twinkling eyes that are sane with you. But each of us has to do this in our own way. When Rick said to me that he hoped I would give advice as to how we could get government permission to do research on psychedelic drugs, I'm definitely beyond the government permission situation. I mean, like several hundred million East Europeans fuck the government. I mean, let's go on for them. But also, one way I found to get common sense. Common sense is so important. I'll give you 3 little common sense things you can do. I was on a radio program talking to someone in Mississippi, Alabama, and somebody talking about marijuana. You know, they say marijuana kills, and I said, you know, marijuana is really not very dangerous. I think it's the least dangerous thing around. And this old farm guy says that, well, I'd like to talk to you, Dr. Leary. Says you say that marijuana is not dangerous. It seriously injured my son, Billy. I said, oh, gee, I'm sorry. What happened to Billy? He said, well, the damn fool went out of the barn and made a mistake, and half a ton of it landed on his arm. Another great one, about 6 months ago, there was a full-page ad in the LA Times, the New York Times, the Pravda. I mean, every Times, every paper in the country had this enormous big full-page ad, all white space except a frying pan. And in the frying pan is a frying egg, and it says, this is your brain on drugs. So there's always a counterculture. There's always the underground. It happened in the Soviet Union. It's happening here. I got about 5 copies of another advertisement. Same idea, white space. It's a plate now, and on this plate is a fried egg with 2 pieces of bacon and some toast. And it said, this is your brain with bacon and buttered toast. That's just common sense. Well, I don't want you to feel that because I'm making fun of the drug crusaders that I'm not compassionate. We've got to be tremendously empathetic and understand that the people who run the industrial age and run the machinery, they're in despair. It's all over. They know that old thing is not going to work anymore. They're all out of jobs. I mean, for example, you know, when the wall went down, there's no more evil empire to fight. I was debating G. Gordon Liddy 2 nights ago in Chicago, and I said, Gordon, he's not changed at all. He's still talking about America's a little old lady in the streets. We need big guns around. I said, Gordon, as your friend, I've got to intervene now and take you to the Betty Ford Clinic to help you break your gun habit. I mean, I know it's hard, Gordon. You're suffering some severe enemy deprivation. Amen. What's going to happen in the next 4 or 5 years, the advanced underground psychedelic counterculture of the computer software industry, many of whom are in this room right now, are producing something called artificial reality gear, virtual reality gear. I call it electronic software, WAR. These are suits. You climb into a computer, you know about it, you put your goggles on, but the goggles are screens, and then you produce any kind of, you create any reality you want. Like, shall we meet for lunch? Shall we meet in Taj Mahal? Do you want to meet in the ski slope at San Moritz? What do you got in your San Moritz file? No, how about try this? See, we're going to be living, inhabiting, traveling in artificial reality. The very concept, artificial reality. I mean, isn't that thrilling? I know a lot of people don't like the word artificial. A lot of people think that, a lot of people tell me drugs are artificial. I said, you mean marijuana has been around for 20,000 years? You call that artificial? All right, the artificial reality here is going to hook up with the psychedelic brain. Now, the question here is, what would I have done differently? Let me think about it. Thank you very much.
See, that's what moved into the office next door to me at Harvard when I was... I mean, I was really trying to be what my mother wanted. But what chance did I have? I mean, he just... Oh, it's a delight. And I really want to honor Timothy. Timothy was a person who took me out of a fate worse than death, which was being a successful citizen. And started me on a journey that I think is the richest possible journey I could have had in a lifetime. And I think that he was the first ray of light for me. And I want to honor that. I just want to add my voice by saying that this week in Congress, in a joint session of Congress, the new president of Czechoslovakia said, "Without a global revolution in the sphere of human consciousness, nothing will change for the better in the sphere of our being." And even now, I'm afraid President Bush and Mr. Sununu are trying to figure out how to contain the damage and potential chaos in which they lose their unstable king of the mountain position. But it is clear now that a historically irreversible process has started. And that's exactly what happened in the 60s. A historically irreversible process started. It didn't really start there, as Tim pointed out. It goes way back in all of human history. But something did happen in the 60s that was prepared for by doors of perception, that was prepared for by the beats in the 50s. Something happened that was of no less moment than what has just happened in Eastern Europe and Tiananmen Square and so on. And we are all now cleaning up after it, not in a negative sense, but figuring out what to do with the fact that it happened. And we can hardly understand the implications of what it means in our lives. And we are sitting here often feeling like we are the downtrodden. And it's quite the reverse. We have figured out how it happened. And now, as people on the platform have said in the earlier panel, now it's up to each individual one of us. The way Gandhi said, "My life is my message." Now the way each of us lives makes a statement that it did work, that it did happen. I can't really any longer be frightened of the dragons of government. I can't really, because I see how ephemeral and how paper tigerish they are. And I feel the fear in the culture. And I feel that what's required of us, it's interesting. I find myself in a funny position today because I'm caught between Rick's desire for us to put forward a good face, to be responsible researchers, to play a part in the game of Western science. And I'm also, on the other side, seeing that what has happened is far more profound than that. And that what we are doing now is trying to find a way to bring more people along through trying to legitimize our game in society. But the underground process in which psychedelics have continued to be used in the society and have come into mainstream consciousness, that goes on independent of whether we lose or win on the front we're talking about in research. Now, I was asked to talk about what are the benefits of what we did in the 60s and what are our mistakes. Tim didn't deal with what he might have done differently. So, but I can play the straight part, which I've done doing with Tim for years. Here are the things that happened as I can see it from what started in that period. First of all, the culture broke out of the psychotomimetic model of using chemicals. That up until then, in this society, primarily these chemicals were considered psychosis-inducing and under the control of the psychiatric establishment. These chemicals started to be seen, these herbs and plants, started to be seen as sacraments, as they are used in other societies. They were used for creative purposes, and the therapeutic possibilities started to become apparent. The chemicals in the early 60s among the 15 to 25-year-olds became a rite of passage, which was shown in the Woodstock moment. In a culture very sadly lacking in rites of passage, where there is a lot of confusion about shift from childhood to maturity. That period made us clear that it wasn't just the chemical you ingested, but it was the set and setting. And here, of course, the traditions like the American Indian and the shamanic traditions, we knew all that, but we never listened to it. After I started with psychedelics, suddenly books that I had passed on the bookshelf saying what a bunch of rot suddenly became the most treasured volumes for me. Books of American Indian law, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, things like that, the Upanishads and the Vedas. In other words, it opened our link to the East and to an incredibly rich philosophical, psychological, and spiritual heritage of humanity that we had primarily been closed to, except for Max Muller, just a very few things. It really opened us to the East, and I've been living off it ever since. And partly the way it did that was because the chemicals in the psychedelics allowed us to override our habits of thinking. And when we looked around in Western psychology for models about that, they were absent. And when we looked in the East, in things like the Visuddhimagga, there they were, very beautifully articulated. And here were a group of people in the East that we had treated really almost as barbarians, that had a wisdom about human consciousness that became our elders. And one of them, of course, became my guru. So it opened us to meditation and spiritual practices. Of course, it became faddish in the 70s, but beyond the fads of gurus and all that, there was a deep process, and there is a deep meditative investment in this society at this moment. Whether you call it stress reduction or whatever you call it, it's there, and it's growing all the time. And that's part of the result of what happened in the 60s. It opened ways for networking because it opened our horizontal power structures rather than our vertical power structures. And that's part of the information age that Tim's talking about now. In a way, it was a precursor of that in allowing us to see vertical institutions as much more ephemeral. And that was the deeper part of the shift that happened then, which I think is the most fundamental shift, which was the shift in our perception of reality. That what happened to us was what I think Einstein did to Newton. It went from treating a reality as absolute to seeing that all realities are relative. And the minute you do that, social institutions are up for grabs. That changes the whole ballgame right there. And that is one of the things that has happened, and that isn't turnable back. And that's part of why there is so much chaos in the moment in the culture, because social institutions which kept the structures going are breaking down because people don't value them. In Boston, when I was growing up, on Sunday you went to church. Now on Sunday you go to the shopping mall. That's a difference in values. Family structures broke down. And we don't have to say values, we just have to look at change. And the question is, who rides with change and who gets frightened and tries to grab at the old history? And this is a moment when changing from absolute reality to relative reality is a tremendous opportunity for growth, and it has a lot of scariness to it. But that's part of what our work is. That shift of reality started to spread into the world through minstrels like Bob Dylan and like the Jefferson Airplane and the Grateful Dead and Rolling Stones and Big Brother and on and on. And it's gotten so far now, I'll tell you how far it's gotten, that if I speak now in the Middle West, which I'll be doing in a few weeks when I'm on tour, if I speak in a relatively medium-sized city, I can look at an audience in which 70 to 80% of the audience has never taken psychedelics, they have never read Eastern literature, they've never been to the East. And I can say exactly the same things I said in 1965 or 70, which then were heard by an audience of a few people between 15 and 25, and that audience is going, yes. The audience in the Midwest is saying, yeah, we hear you. Now, how do they hear us? What happened? How did those values get inculcated into the culture? I think because you can't see it, you don't think it exists. But then when you get these little clues around the edge, you begin to see the profundity of what the social changes that were wrought at that point in the 60s. The Grateful Dead now is a major religious ritual, and it's on its way up. Our work with the dying, the work started really by Eric Cast and people like that way back, beautiful men. That has done incredibly in terms of awakening us, bringing death out of the closet. And a lot of the way in which now so many people want to work with the dying comes out of that kind of psychedelic process that happened in the 60s. Okay, I think I should say something about the mistakes. Of the early 60s of our research. In one way, I kind of am with Timothy, what mistakes? It was life, we did the best we could. So I don't say these in some sense of, I don't know what sense I say them in, I'll just say them. When we did that research at Harvard, very shortly after the beginning, we realized that this was a heresy to that social institution. That the Harvard is an institution committed to the intellect and to rational analytic process. And when we brought on something that dealt with intuitive, transcendent, unitive experiences, in which the intellect became a subsystem rather than the metasystem, we were taking on the priest class of the church, and we were doing it within the confines of that church. And what we were doing is going on to a tennis court with football cleats. It's the way I would understand it. And I think that once we got going, because we were ingesting our own product, we lost our connection with the community around us. And I feel that this was neither our fault nor their fault. It was one of the results of the profundity of this experience that we couldn't turn away and couldn't turn back. But we did lose our support system, and we didn't slow down enough to keep it with us, because it finally got to the point of who's taken it and who hasn't. And that bridge became unbridgeable after a while. And it was shocking to us that people we loved and worked with as colleagues no longer were our colleagues. I think we got a little confused about evolution and revolution. And I think we played with the revolutionary aspects of psychedelics, when to me the far more interesting issue are the evolutionary aspects. And I think that had we been more evolved in our wisdom and not feeling we were inventing the wheel all over again, we would have had an appreciation of what the fears were of the society and how to work with those fears rather than just pitting ourselves against them. I don't think the way we did it was the only way it could have been done. I think we were over-enthusiastic about how easy behavior change would be. When I look at many of my friends that I took acid with in the 60s, I see that there's been a lot of work they've done, but there's a lot yet to do. And I remember Tim and I had a chart on the wall of how soon everybody would get enlightened. But the real changes are harder. I think we downplayed the fact that the psychedelic experience isn't necessarily for everybody, and that people intuitively can be trusted. We did say this in Politics of Consciousness. We said people must control their own consciousness, and all we have a right to do is educate people as to what the issues are and where you can go and what to be careful of and what to be aware of. And I think that we were somewhat insensitive to the issues of the people that weren't really ready to handle this. My personal era, in view of the fear people have of their children, for their children, and of their children now, was in giving psychedelics to undergraduates. That started a chain, and I did that for many reasons. Sexual was not excluded. Now, but at this point, the genie is out of the bottle. Plenty of us know the difference between crack and psilocybin. Plenty of us will continue to do just what we are doing, to work on our consciousness, laws notwithstanding. Truth cannot be repressed. It cannot be legislated out of existence. Psychedelics are a healthy pseudopod of a society. And they have to be honored, and they will be honored. You understand that the government's reaction is predictable and understandable. And I feel pain for their fear of change. But change is in the air. And we can't be hypocritical and make believe that it's ever going to be the same again, because it isn't. I feel that psychedelics, just as our American Indian friend said that it was a part of his life, I feel they have changed my life in the most profound way. I honor them and will continue to honor them. And I will stand up as a person who has had psychedelics many times more than 400, which is the usual published report. And I continue to take psychedelics. If I am psychotic, I am a sample. But maybe I'm not. And maybe that was the training that was part of my preparation to be a social philosopher or a wise person in society. This meeting is a meeting in which in all of our hearts we know truth. How it will manifest outward depends on our commitment to our own truth. Now, as we face the ecological issues of the times, the political issues of the times, change and potential chaos, people that have already dealt with that chaos of mind psychedelically will be there to lend this culture strength and equanimity in the face of uncertainty. Thank you.
All right, the first person I want to tell you about is Dr. Jan Bastiaans in the Netherlands. He has been an emeritus professor of psychiatry for a couple of years at the University of Leiden and began working with LSD in 1961. And for many years, he had the only authorization anywhere in the world to use LSD in clinical work with patients. And he maintained that authorization until 1988 when he retired from the university at 70. He has specialized in treating concentration camp survivors with LSD since 1961. Right after the war, he used narcoanalysis to try to reach these patients who had been so traumatized by their experiences in the camps. And for those of you who don't know, narcoanalysis is a psychiatric interview using either sodium amytal or sodium pentothal to help loosen defenses and bring about a release of repressed feeling or traumatic memory. Typically, a concentration camp survivor would spend 3 days here, a day of preparation, the session day itself, and then a third day of follow-up. So you have that element of inpatient support, but at the same time, it's in a very comfortable home-like setting, which we all know is extremely important. Now I want to go to Germany to talk about Professor Hans-Karl Leuner. Dr. Leuner is one of the earliest pioneers of LSD therapy in Europe. He began working with the drug with psychotic patients in about 1955, and he has never stopped doing psycholytic therapy since that day. Dr. Schlichting is pioneering the study with the new phenethylamine, and they're doing a formal pre-post test clinical study on the therapeutic effects of this drug. And the initial results are quite encouraging, according to Dr. Schlichting. Dr. Baumann began writing to the Swiss government in about 1983 to find out whether they would be open to taking another look at the use of LSD and other psychoactive substances in psychotherapy. And they told him to go ahead and write to the other psychiatrists in Switzerland. He wrote to all 700 of them, and only 80 wrote back saying that they would be interested in getting more information about LSD and LSD therapy. 21 said they'd be actively interested in using the drug in therapy, and so they formed an association, the Swiss Physicians Association for Psycholytic Therapy, and that was formed in 1986. And then in June of 1988, they succeeded in getting authorization for just about everything they would want to use in therapy: LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, MDMA, and 2CB. Okay. About 2 years ago, Dr. Oscar Janiger was one of the pioneers of LSD research in Southern California, and I formed a nonprofit corporation to bring together all of the psychedelic research that's been done to date worldwide. We feel that it's crucial that all of the work that's been done be brought together in one world repository so that it can be preserved for future generations of researchers and historians. We intend to establish a library, an art gallery, and a conference center dedicated to consciousness research. From an interdisciplinary point of view, it will be based in Los Angeles, but in time, the entire archive will be computerized so that it will be available online to anybody who has an interest in these matters worldwide. So all you'll need is a personal computer, and you can call the Hoffman Foundation.
Been known to disagree even with things I didn't disagree with. Just to get an argument started. I am a policy analyst by trade. I study the advantages and disadvantages of different courses of action, primarily courses of action that public bodies might take or not take. For the last 11 years, I've been working on primarily drug abuse control policy, but also crime control more generally. I look at the cost side of drug use. I look at the disease and violence that are associated with, under some circumstances, associated with the use and the distribution of both licit and illicit drugs. I spend a lot of time actually worrying about alcohol and tobacco. And it is peculiar that alcohol and tobacco are the only two drugs I'm allowed to denounce in this audience, and be sure of a warm welcome. There are other audiences, of course, which are shocked when I say alcohol, tobacco, and the illicit drugs, or alcohol, tobacco, and the other dangerous drugs. I mean, Bill Bannett doesn't much want to hear that his nicotine habit and somebody else's cocaine habit may have a lot in common. Our topic here I take to be performance-enhancing drugs. I'll take it as common currency in this room that there have been developed, are being developed, will be developed relatively soon, chemicals which will, in measurable and demonstrable ways, boost the performance of the human mind on a variety of tasks. Provide empathy, help empathy, provide insight, speed cognitive functioning, improve memory. The list could be quite long. And the question is, how do our current regulatory regimes interact with the fact that performance-enhancing drugs are being developed? And is it possible, either possible to design or possible to practically bring about, a change in those regulatory regimes which will tend to interfere less with beneficial uses? One of the problems, as we've seen at least since the early 60s, with the development of performance-enhancing drugs, is that in a society whose dominant images and modes of drug use are quantitative and therefore naturally excessive, in such a society, any performance-enhancing drug that is developed will be used recreationally and quantitatively with disastrous effects for some of the people involved. They will either not know in advance that they're going to have bad results, or they will continue to labor under the illusion that they're having good results when it doesn't look like that way to the people around them. If we could get this society to define excess rather than drugs as the enemy to be made war on, we would have made great progress.
If I want to change external reality, the most effective way that I can do that is by working on something inside my head, on the perception of the external thing. And that as I work on that, the external reality changes. And that to me is very mysterious and fascinating and wonderful and very difficult to explain to people who are caught up in the illusory vision of cause and effect that seems to dominate our science and our intellectuals and our universities and people who are committed to rational thought. It's a sense that consciousness is a very powerful tool that connects us to everything, that everything is consciousness in some form, and that the consciousness in my head is connected to not only other conscious people, but to animals, to plants, to things that we consider non-living as well, that there is some unity or theme which I relate to on that level that makes it possible for me to participate in all the activities of the universe and influence them in some way. And that's an ultimately empowering thought. Also scary in some ways, because it does mean taking more responsibility for reality as I experience it, and is a very strong prod into action that if I don't like the way things are, to really work on myself to make them better.
The claim that here's a drug which, if you're healthy, will make you better is not now a claim that anybody in the government has the language to deal with. I mean, that's a brand new idea. It's clearly going to be true for a wide range of, at some level. We know that cocaine wine is a performance-enhancing drug. Ask Thomas Edison. So the question is not providing evidence that for some people there are performance-enhancing drugs. The question is convincing people that the regulatory regime we had can be adapted or ought to be adapted to meet that problem. My guess is that somebody's going to develop a memory-enhancing drug or a hard work-enhancing drug, and it's going to be a psychological steroid. That you're going to have underground distribution of it. You're going to have relentless quantitative excess of it. You're going to have people genuinely burning themselves out on it. And we're going to just relive the 60s again. I think that the progress of neurochemistry is probably faster than the progress of regulation. But I don't think that it will go nearly as well if it doesn't wind up someplace with supportive and appropriately restrictive regulatory regimes.
My name is Elise Agar Wittine, and I was the coordinator of the conference, and it's really nice that you're applauding me, especially if you were here this afternoon and we're part of the crisis we had. But I appreciate those people who were here this afternoon were able to bear with us, because the hotel gave us quite a hard time about the number of people we had and the fire laws they have. So we've really had...
I had dropped out of school in order to try to get permission from the Food and Drug Administration to do an experiment with MDMA with my grandmother. Well, I actually went to an experimental school and we made up a class called Doing Drugs with Grandma, which was about the struggle with the FDA. But basically, she had unipolar depression, and she had been unsuccessfully treated. She'd been in the hospital several times. She'd had electroshock therapy. She'd had every single conceivable drug, and for her life was really not very bearable. And with her doctors, with my family's permission, with some of the experts that are here today and people around the country, we prepared an application to the FDA asking for permission to explore the use of MDMA in the treatment of resistant unipolar depression. And I got back a letter saying that the application was refused because of this potential question of brain damage. Now, my grandmother at this time was like 78 years old. And people have been taking MDMA for 20, 25 years, and there's no sign of brain damage. And if it occurs a really long time. But they felt that they were in this role trying to protect her from this brain damage. And I felt that my whole life had sort of been geared up to trying to help her, and it was not successful. And what I learned from that is that I would keep trying whatever way it took. And the woman at the Kennedy School said that was what made them decide to let me in, that they really felt that they should train a psychedelic activist with their limited resources. And that touched me quite a lot, that they would be willing to give me this chance. And so as time's gone by, we've done quite a lot of preparatory work and done quite a lot of research. And the purpose of this benefit is to try to both bring us all together as a community, but also to try to raise funds to stimulate more research into trying to make MDMA into a medicine. So for that, I'd just like to welcome you all here, and I'm so glad that you've decided to help in this endeavor.
Most of you know, I'm sure, that MDMA is an abbreviation for 3,4-methylene dioxymethamphetamine. It's a psychoactive drug. It bears some similarities to stimulants, such as amphetamine, and some similarities to hallucinogens, such as mescaline. MDMA is sold on the street or in the underground under a number of names, but probably the most common one is ecstasy, which is perhaps a misnomer, but at any rate, that's what it's commonly called. MDMA is somewhat unique in that it's neither a hallucinogen, that is, it doesn't cause profound perceptual changes, nor is it a psychotomimetic. It doesn't make you act crazy and it doesn't make you feel crazy. What it does do is make you feel calm, and it helps you to get in touch with your feelings, and it gives you some insight perhaps into your emotional and psychological state. MDMA belongs to it's one of a number of amphetamine derivatives that are known to have long-term effects on those parts of the brain containing the neurotransmitter serotonin. Some investigators have interpreted the evidence of these long-term effects as neurotoxicity. Neurotoxicity is a politically loaded word, and I hesitate to use it in this context. I think long-term effects is perhaps a better way to characterize this. The other point that I think needs to be made is that almost all the data that we'll be talking about tonight is well established in animals, and all the studies, or practically nearly all of the studies that have been done on the long-term effects of MDMA have been done in animals.
I see so often that substances, for example, and techniques that are not approved and that the regular medical authorities are not making money off of are condemned because people have direct access to them. An example is this cheap chemical called DMSO, which is very effective at reducing inflammation and treating things like bursitis, for example. The FDA has banned this for human use for years. It will not move an inch on this. It says it causes cataracts in the eyes of rats and mice. It's never done that in a primate. I think whether they realize it or not, the pharmaceutical industry and the institution of pharmacy and the medical profession are very threatened at the idea of people having direct access to a cheap substance that really works and that none of them are profiting from. And that applies very much in the area on the broader scale of psychedelics and their power to put us in touch with all of these things.
These are all well recognized in people that work on the serotonin system as serotonergic neurotoxins. Again, I use these terms advisedly. Fenfluramine is interesting because it is a prescription drug that is prescribed as an appetite suppressant. It's been on the market since about 1968, and it's estimated that 25 million people, more or less, have taken fenfluramine on a daily basis for what is sometimes years of use. In animals, fenfluramine is approximately 4 times more toxic than MDMA on a by-weight basis. Specifically, MDMA and fenfluramine and these other derivatives shown in the previous slide show selective effects and long-term effects on brain neurons which contain the neurotransmitter serotonin, which is also known as 5-hydroxytryptamine. And this slide just shows the serotonin synapse and a number of the biochemical events that go on at that synapse that are important in the action of serotonin. Serotonin containing neurons have a very wide distribution in the brain and are especially dense in the cortex, hippocampus, and parts of the limbic system. But the serotonin-containing neurons, or the 5-HT-containing neurons, arise primarily from a small cluster of cells in the brainstem known as the raphe or the RAFE nuclei. And serotonin has been known as a neurotransmitter for over 40 years and has been the subject of intense study. And yet, for all that, we still have a very cloudy understanding of just what the functions of serotonin are. we know that it's a modulator of many different functions and behaviors, and it has a hand in sleep, appetite, sexual function, mood, affective disorders, and so on. You name a psychological or a neurophysiological process that doesn't involve serotonin, it's actually hard to find. But no one has been able to put their finger on any one function or any one process and say, that is the function of serotonin. It's simply involved in too many things, and we don't understand exactly what's going on. So in terms of the effects of MDMA, the long-term effects of MDMA, which some have said are indicative of neurotoxicity, there are basically three areas. One is that it causes long-term levels, a long-term persistent reduction. And again, I'm stressing this as animals at high doses or relatively high doses. It causes long-term reduction in the levels of serotonin itself, the neurotransmitter, and its metabolites, primarily 5-hydroxy-indolacetic acid. What is shown in addition, it causes long-term reductions in the activity of the enzyme tryptophan hydroxylase, which is the first enzyme that's involved in the biosynthetic pathway that converts the tryptophan, the amino acid, which you require in your diet, to serotonin. It suppresses the effect of this enzyme. It suppresses the activity. And that's basically what is shown in this graph here.
Admitting the reality of the non-physical, of the centrality of consciousness in the role of cause and effect between mind and body. I think that if that began to change, that would detoxify a lot of science and medicine. Science is very destructive in our world today. It needn't be. And technology and science needn't be destructive. You know, it's as I said earlier today, that our interactions with nature can produce beautiful things, wonderful things, if our interactions are guided by wisdom and a sense of unity and connectedness with nature. I have learned a lot of those lessons from my psychedelic experiences, and I honor and acknowledge that. And for people for whom that's the path, I think it's great. I think there are other paths to that same kind of knowledge and understanding. And the more people that move in those directions, I think the more everything will continue to go along just as it's supposed to go.
Beside the biochemical evidence, there's also histological evidence of neurodegeneration. And you can measure that a number of ways, but perhaps the most dramatic way is to take brain sections from a rat, and you can specifically stain the serotonin-containing neurons. And when you do that, and you place the MDMA-treated animals shown on the left against the control-treated animals, the saline-treated animals on the right, it looks like this serotonin-containing neurons have been fairly well basically ablated, or there is some evidence of neurodegeneration. Now, there are a number of different kinds of serotonergic fibers, but the fibers that MDMA selectively ablates are the so-called thin fibers, which arise from a different part of the raphe nuclei than the so-called thick fibers, which it basically leaves untouched. What are the clinical implications of this for human users of MDMA? Well, the answer is basically, if you're going to give the only honest answer you can give, the answer is basically that we don't know. Part of this is because we don't understand the functions of serotonin very well. So we can't put our finger on some clinical pathology to some clearly clinical deficit and say, in the human user, you can't sleep, or you can't remember, or you cannot function sexually or whatever, and say, and that's because you used high doses of MDMA. We can't do that because we don't understand what serotonin is doing. So it's hard to say what would happen if the serotonin system were markedly impaired. There's some reason for reassurance, however. in the fact that no obvious clinical or neurological deficit has come to light in people that have been taking fenfluramine daily for years as an appetite suppressant. Fenfluramine is even more toxic than MDMA, and it seems that if there were long-term dangerous side effects from the ingestion of these serotonin type neurotoxins, they would have come to light by this time, because it's been around since 1968.
We don't call the peyote a drug. It is not a drug. It's a holy plant. And when somebody says that, we say, well, that's very being sarcastic, and it's just not the proper name for it. So I wanted to tell you all that, and I think it's important that we, that you understand, how we gather, our herbs and pray to that.
As far as I'm aware, there's no effort to take fenfluramine off the market because it's a serotonin neurotoxin. This may also be because it has a certain advocacy in the sense that the pharmaceutical company that manufactures it has a certain stake in seeing it remain on the market. But until we know more about the functions of serotonin, about the possible implications of these long-term effects, and whether they happen in humans or not, we don't know. But until we know more, I would say that caution is advised, and caution in two respects. One is we should exercise a certain caution in the frequency and the size of doses of MDMA that people use, because the animal data shows that it's a question of dose frequency and the size of the dose both bear a direct correlation to the appearance of this neurotoxicity. The second kind of caution that I would advocate is a certain caution in extrapolating the results of animal studies to humans. That is, it's relatively well understood in animals and rather poorly understood in humans. Until we know more, caution on a number of fronts is advisable. But for right now, the evidence is that at the doses and frequencies normally used by humans, MDMA is probably safe.
A new day, a new hope, a new beginning. And sure enough, that the sun is coming up and he's blessed us with another day. So when we pray, we always pray for something good for future generation. So our elders tell us, that's what it means.
Thanks to the work of people like Robbie Overlander and Dave Nichols at Purdue, and Robbie Overlander is sitting in the audience here tonight, the non-neurotoxic entactogens are already here. And that's what's shown in this slide. These are some structural analogs of MDMA, which according to animal studies, behavioral studies, have all of the entactogenic effects of MDMA, but the biochemical and histological studies have none of the neurotoxicity, none of the long-term neurotoxic effects of MDMA. Now, we don't have human data on these. All indications are from the animal behavioral studies that these are MDMA-like entactogens. I don't know if anyone has determined from personal experience whether they actually do elicit the entactogenic experience in persons. I don't know that a person could, even if they knew that, could admit that because of the structure of the legal questions involved. Is the investigation of this class of psychopharmacological agents going to be recognized as legitimate? Is the idea that you can develop entactogens, empathogens, hallucinogens, call them whatever you want, but the idea that you can develop agents which not merely control the symptoms of mental illness or mental neurosis or whatever, but could actively facilitate the recovery in conjunction with the right kinds of psychotherapy. We now have the capability to develop these agents. They're out there. Is the FDA going to recognize this as a legitimate province of the science of psychopharmacology, or is this kind of information going to remain underground and unknown? That, it seems to me, is the crux of the issue. I don't have the answer. If somebody does, I'd like to hear it, but that's where it stands. So I thank you for listening.
With Debbie Harlow and Doug McDonald and Lynn Watson, what we did was had an incredibly diverse team and tried to look at all the different social worlds of MDMA users, both therapeutically oriented and recreationally oriented, and I think the vast majority fall somewhere in between, and trying to find out more about the reasons for use, the meaning of use for these different groups of people, and what they saw as perceived benefits, risks, and their evolving use patterns around the drug, and really trying to look at the abuse potential question. So real quickly, just skipping along the findings, almost everyone liked MDMA. Somewhat of an understatement. One reason is we had a criteria of at least 3 times. There's a lot of people who tried, and we interviewed a lot of people informally who tried MDMA once or twice who really didn't get an experience, were bored with the experience, or for whatever reasons didn't continue. And some people who had adverse experiences, but seemed to be very rare. Most of the people who did do it at least 3 times greatly enjoyed it. What was different was why they liked it. The perceived benefits, there was a lot of unanimity around what were the attractions of the drug, but there was a lot of difference in terms of what was the most meaningful of those attractions or those benefits. A lot of people thought that the enhanced communication, the empathy, the bonding, the reduced fear, these therapeutic benefits were the most important aspects of the MDMA experience. Recreational users, on the other hand, and by virtue, you can see the use of ecstasy among these users as opposed to Adam among the more therapeutically inclined users. These users were more in pursuit of this ecstasy or the euphoria, the sensuousness associated with the drug. So the meaning was very different for these people, and the experience itself was very different. And don't really have time to go into it now, but what we tried to look at also was the effect of media, the publicity about this drug on these different social worlds of users in shaping their expectations around the experience. And the same thing happened earlier with LSD, and shaping their use patterns as well and their actual experience itself. Real quickly, the perceived problems with the drugs, just like some folks, almost everyone really liked it. Some people liked it too much. We deliberately tried to go out and sample people who abused the drug, who are either very frequent users, I would define that as, say, over a couple hundred times in the course of 5 to 10 years, or people who are binge users. And binge users tend to be people who are binging with coke or meth anyway, methamphetamine. Tended to be people who would be weekenders, would go through a half a gram to a gram over the course of a day or a weekend or an evening or something like that. And looking at Dennis's findings and other people's findings, this is of some concern because these people are doing excessive amounts of MDMA, and the neurotoxicity question is particularly relevant for these people. Nevertheless, most people, this was a very small percentage of our population, even though we searched these people out. By far, the vast majority of people used it sparingly. One thing, even the recreational users who were introduced to MDMA in a very recreational context, we did a lot of research in Dallas bar scene, went there, and acid house scene, these different bar scenes, which I characterize as the more faddish use described by the media. Even these people often fortuitously sensed the therapeutic benefits, and a lot of them changed their perspective on MDMA to a more therapeutic outlook on it. And so almost everyone saw that it had therapeutic advantages, whether they were using it for that reason or not, whether they're using it more for recreational reasons. But definitely, almost everyone commented, even the most extreme recreational user, that they thought that MDMA, in terms of enhanced communication, closeness to others, the oneness, the empathy, were things that they experienced and they felt would be helpful to at least some people. In terms of the therapeutic potential of MDMA or other psychedelics, basically drugs that have potential for insight enhancement, There's been a real distrust on the part of the government, the public, psychiatrists, medicine in general, around these drugs. And one reason is that the scientific method is inadequate for evaluating the potential of these. Very difficult to prove psychotherapeutic drugs, insight-enhancing drugs, to really work in double-blind controlled experiments. It's possible, but difficult, and it's difficult to get real exact answers from it. And the result, what we're left with, is a bunch of pharmacological depressants for almost any type of mental disorder, whether it's ranging from neurosis to psychosis to terminal illness. All we have is, as David Nichols really eloquently declared, is that it's a harsh reality indeed that tells patients with emotional pain to suffer quietly, that they will not be helped except with drugs that dull the mind. And I would just close with arguing that there has to be some form of developing an informed consent for consenting adults to be able to have access to these drugs. The most obvious case is something like terminal illness, but also for other types of, I would go beyond just psychological disorders, but for people that are knowledgeable about what the potential risks are of these drugs and also the potential benefits. I guess I'll close with that.
When I wrote the book, Ecstasy, the MDMA Story, I was hoping to present a picture of a remarkable new catalyst for psychotherapy and for spiritual growth and self-exploration. Instead, I was confronted with this hysteria. No major publication would review my book. The bookstores wouldn't carry it, and it was very frustrating for me. And that's where it stands right now.
This was something that happened about 1 year before he died. He took a very small dosage of psilocybin, 4 mg. We were in my studio. Our house, our home had burned, and I had a studio to work with. And usually we put sounds, of course, flowers, everything is very quiet. There is the sound in the Bach. There was the musical offering, I think. And after he took this, usually there was a period of quietness, just tranquility, listening, seeing what's going to go on, to happen. Well, this time something completely different happened. To begin with, Olga said, please turn off the music. Well, that was strange. And then he began to pace up and down in a very worried way. And I was trying to hear what he was saying. He said the word limbo, and he said the word confusion. And it was very, very strange and different. Went on for about 20 minutes. And then suddenly he sat down near the tape recorder, and he said, everything is fine now. And the first word, the tape recorder was on, the first word on tape are...
You see, this is... I was thinking of one of your titles. This is one of the ways of trying to make ice cubes out of running water, isn't it? To fix something and try to keep it. Of course, it's always wrong.
I thought he was speaking about the recorder, so I said, well, let's stop the recorder.
No, I don't mean that. I mean, the pure light is the greatest ice cube of all. The ultimate ice cube.
I was then writing my recipes for living and loving, and one of them was called, don't try to make ice cube out of a flowing river. Is the idea of not trying to stop life, which is flowing and changing all the time. And that recipe gave me some trouble in writing, and so it was a current phrase with us.
The pure light. This is the greatest ice cube of all. It's the ultimate ice cube.
You thought you were going to have that today?
Well, now I can if I want to, but I mean, it's very good to realize that it is just the, so to say, the mirror image of this other thing. It's just this total distraction. I mean, if you can immobilize the total distraction long enough, then it becomes the pure one-pointed distraction, pure light.
Well, if you can immobilize it, well, what do you mean?
You can immobilize it, but it isn't the real thing. You can remain for eternity in this thing at the exclusion of love and work.
Well, but I thought that thing was love and work.
Exactly. I mean, this is why it is wrong, as I was saying. This illustrates that you mustn't make ice cubes out of a flowing river. You may succeed in making ice cubes. This is the greatest ice cube in the world, but you can probably go on for, you can't go on forever, but for enormous eons, for what appears to be eternity being in the light. It completely denies the facts. It's morally wrong, and finally, of course, absolutely catastrophic.
Absolutely catastrophic. Those words are said with such a profound conviction.
But you have so many ideas. Obviously, this terribly hard skull has a hole in it somewhere.
I hope so.
It's certainly very remarkable.
Paulus, I don't remember if I told you that phrase that is running in my mind this day. I am 1,000 people.
No, you didn't tell me.
But that also doesn't make anything very easy, you know, to be 1,000 people.
No, obviously. And when there is no anchorage anywhere, when to come back to after death, I mean, there will be no anchorage.
Oh, I see.
So when there will be 1,000 people rushing in different directions, I mean, anyhow, your hair smells the same as acacias. Your head is very solid. Because the point is, when there isn't anything like this...
Oh, you mean a tangible body, yes? When there is something to hold on.
There are 1,000 different people going in 1,000 different directions, and this is what you have a hint of now, and this, of course, is what is so terrible. But I think that I know that there will always be, and I mean this is the extraordinary experience, at least there is somebody there who knows there are 1,000 other people going in different directions. That there is a fundamental sanity of the world, which is always there in spite of the 1,000 people going in 1,000 different directions. And while we are in space and time, surrounded by gravity, we are controlled to a considerable extent. But to have an insight into what it is when there isn't any control except this fundamental knowledge, I mean, this is where the bardos are right.
Yes, Aldous was referring to the Tibetan Book of the Dead that he had used to take his wife when she died.
The bardo is right. You see, you have to be aware of this thing and hang on to it for dear life. Otherwise, you're just completely in a whirlwind.
Yes, but how many people know this?
Exactly. That is why they say we really ought to start preparing for this. And I must say, I think it's terribly important that through this knowledge that we get through these mushrooms, or whatever it is, you understand a little bit about what it's all about. I think the most extraordinary experience is to know that there is all this insanity, which is just the multiplication, the caricature of normal insanity that goes on, but that there is a fundamental sanity which one can remain with and be aware of. This, of course, is the whole doctrine of the bardo, helping people to be aware of the fundamental sanity which is there in spite of all the terrifying things, and also not really terrifying, but sometimes ecstatic, wonderful things. You mustn't go to heaven, as they continually say.
You mustn't go to heaven?
Okay, you've got it. You mustn't go to heaven. It's just as dangerous. It's temporary. And somehow you want to hold on to the ultimate truth of things.
The ultimate truth of things?
Well, I mean the total light of the world. I suppose which is in the here and now we experience. It's, of course, the mind-body, but when you're released from the body, there has to be some experiential equivalent of the body. Something has to be held on to. I don't know.
What does one hold on, then?
All you can say is fundamental sanity, which I say is guaranteed as long as one is in the body by the fact of space and time and gravity and 3 dimensions and all the rest of it. Somehow, when you get rid of those anchors, but there is an equivalent of some kind which has to be caught hold of. Otherwise, the world about you is thin and becomes, what is the word, pretas, the world of restless ghosts. One goes to hell, and then in desperation, one has to rush back and get another body.
To hold on again.
To hold on again. Well, this is obviously the best thing if one hasn't got the ultimate best. It's very important, if one can, while it is happening, if one can see the outer appearance of it. It's important to look after one's affairs in a sensible way and see their importance in a silly way. But if one can, through all this, see this other level of importance, in the light of which a lot of activities will have to be cut down, there will seem to be absolutely no point in undertaking them, although a great many have to be undertaken. But they'll be undertaken in a new kind of way, with a kind of detachment, yet with a doing things to one's limit. This is again one of the paradoxes, to work to the limit to succeed in what you are doing and at the same time be detached from it. If you don't succeed, well, that's too bad. If you do succeed, you don't have to gloat over it. This is the whole story of the Bhagavad Gita. Somehow to do everything with passion and detachment.
Passion and detachment. My goodness, years ago, with what passion I had longed for detachment. As a musician, I wanted to be able to play with all the passion that naturally the music wakes, and yet have that detachment that brings about a respect for the composer's ideas. And here he's speaking, of course, about the Arjuna, the great warrior, and this teacher Krishna, no? That tells him to go and fight, and yet be detached from the fight.
One can see what it is. He's not involved, even though he's involved up to the limit. What part of him is not involved? It's no good trying to make an analysis because as usual, it's a paradox and a mystery.
Yes, but even if
one begins to understand it, that's the main problem. My nose is running.
Wait.
A very good reminder that the greatest philosophy is connected inextricably with running noses. One of the things they should have talked about in the gospel, obviously he was on a mountain, the Sermon of the Mount. It must have been very breezy and cold up there. Probably his nose did run. Thank you.
Shall we make
I see psychedelic drugs as technologies. They're simply different ways to boot up, activate your brain. So I'm going to finish now, but what's going to happen in the next 10 years is a new form of technology that's going to empower the individual 14-year-old child to suit up and put on, we call it a cyberspace suit or a virtual reality suit, in which you can literally move around the world, meet people. You can have 5 love affairs in different cities. You can be doing your business. Then you take off your suit. And here you are in the physical flesh. In other words, all the work in the future will be done by robots or by virtual reality like that. You don't believe that? When you take off your cyber suit, then you can use the body for what it's supposed to be used for, as an instrument of sacred communication and aesthetic expression and graceful athletics. In other words, to use the body, to even transport your body to do work, you're a robot. You're a serf or you're a robot. In the future, we will use our bodies only for sacramental exchanges or to use your body to do work in the future, when you can suit up and move around like that, would be like using your tongue to clean the floor or your penis to knock a nail in, literally. So, do not think that when we talk about electronic realities that we're depreciating the body. We are freeing the body for what it's supposed to be used for. So what I'm saying is, we are now in the position that the hunter-gatherers were in before there was any kind of artificial tools or habitation. And we're sitting here and saying, hey, I just ate this vegetable. And I could see ahead, the fact we can chip a stone here, that means that pretty soon we can cut down trees, and we're going to be living in houses with wood. We're going to be in rooms where you can't see a tree or you can't see a bush. Oh, no. Yeah, we're in that same position now. The future is going to be creating electronic realities. Think about it, in which we will spend 5 or 6 hours of our time during the day. Now, if that frightens you, remember this horrible, horrible fact, which Tom pinches, by the way, in his new book, Vineland. How many of you read Vineland? Wow. Yeah. The average American watches television 7 hours a day. That means the average American in the most enlightened and rich country in world history lies like a slugoid amoeboid with their optical suckers sucking junk food passively. So instead of doing it passively, we're going to empower with our technology. And I wish Jaron Lanier were here. I wish Eric Gullickson were here. I wish Ted Nelson were here. Who else? Autodesk, Eric Lyon. I wish they were here. Brenda Laurel. There's a group of people working on this. And a lot's going to happen. Main thing, stay sane and look for the new technology. And I love you.
I took mescaline for the first time in 1960, and over the years of using those substances, there's certain themes that I can look back on that have emerged out of those journeys into that other space, and I'd like to just share some of them with you. One of them is a very profound sense that on the level that counts, everything is all right, and that everything is just the way it's supposed to be. However limited and wrong and upside down it looks most of the time, there is that message that comes through. That it seems to me to echo the sentiment that I heard you quote Aldous saying about the fundamental sanity that was underneath that. And that's a very strong message.
I'd like to see the Native American church not have to fight all these court cases. I'd like for all the states throughout the Union to recognize and accept the practices of the Native American Church.
What I would like to see by the year 2000 is the acceptance of the concept and the acceptance of the need for a psychotherapeutic drug that deepens insight and relieves emotional pain. And I think that for the psychiatric profession, to not be aggressively pursuing such a drug is to abandon patients to years of often interminable suffering. And this is the height of irresponsibility. And for the government to impede such research is immoral.
Paine said that if men were angels, they would need no government. And that if there were angels on earth among men, they alone would be the safe governors. So we have the paradoxical problem of trying to supply the defective self-control from the outside when the outside consists entirely of not perfectly self-controlled individuals.
What I'll put out is just more like a wish list, and recognizing that ideas or images or visions that are put out and expressed this way, and this is something I've learned years ago and over the years from my friend Timothy Leary, who understands this principle of the power of thought. You put out a thought, you put out an idea, and it acts as a kind of a magnetic attractor to lead us to that possibility, to that reality. So a couple of very just kind of specific strategy things relating to psychedelic research that I think I'd like to say. One being that our present strategy, where we go into third world countries, we look for plants that might have medicinal use, and we bring them back and we extract what we think is the active ingredient, and we synthesize that active ingredient, and then we package it and market it, and we sell it back to those third world countries at preferably huge profits. Is exactly the reverse of the way we should be doing it. What we should be doing is, and this applies to medicinal plants as well as to visionary or psychic or psychoactive plants and drugs, what we should be doing is what Terence with Botanical Dimensions is doing, is trying to preserve the knowledge of the plants and the knowledge of how the plant is used, and then experiment with that. If we find a drug in the laboratory that has promising effects on the mind, then it seems to me our strategy should be to try to find a plant that contains that drug, because it's well known by now, documented over and over in numerous cases, that there is a world of difference between a plant, a natural substance, and the uses it has found, and a synthesized concentrate, which is too concentrated, too potent, too powerful, and has unpredictable effect in the brain. The example of coca leaf chewing in Andean people, which is a health-maintaining, strengthening, tonic additive to the diet, compared to the effects of synthesized cocaine or crack in urban cultures, is only the most dramatic example of that. The other kind of strategic thing I think that needs to be said is the whole war on drugs could be ended and made unnecessary by decriminalizing drugs. The drugs that are now lead to this enormous superstructure of enforcement. Drugs should be taken out of the role of law enforcement and into the arena of public health, which is where they belong. Major impact has been made on tobacco smoking once government and regulation and advertising and media were used to impact that. And if we try to control tobacco smoking the way we're trying to control, say, cocaine smoking, it would be as obvious a failure in the one case as it is in the other. So, and the role of psychedelic drugs, I think, is relatively minor in that situation. This balancing out of the media and public and business support of some drugs like alcohol, tobacco, and the various psychiatric drugs, which make tremendous profits, regulating those, taking public health factors into account, and then deregulating or putting other drugs like heroin, cocaine, and addictive substances into like the English system or the European system or the Swedish system, where people who are addicted to these substances could obtain them for their reasons, would immediately wipe out the huge criminal underground. It would make a major contribution to the economy. It's been calculated it would wipe out probably 1/3 of the national debt. So it would have wonderful effects all around. And as far as the future role of psychedelic plants and drugs is concerned, my vision of that is that it's going to change as people begin to think more in ecological terms, as we begin to think more in recognition and acknowledgement of our interdependence with all forms of life. And we begin to see that we're related in multiple complex ways with the plant kingdom, the animal kingdom, and with the various kinds of ecosystems in which we live, then there will be communities of people. There will be, I'm very impressed by the bioregional concept. There will be, instead of these monolithic nation states, there will be small, bioregionally localized, largely self-sufficient communities where people will try to live with sensitivity to the land in a sustainable way, self-sufficient, sustainable, and celebrate the diversity that exists within each community as well as among different communities. people will take foods, people will take responsibility for their own health. Instead of relying on a medical system with drugs and so forth for their health, they will take responsibility for their own health. They will adjust their diet, their nutrition. They will pay attention to foods that strengthen the body, food that strengthens the heart, the emotions, the feelings, foods that heighten cognitive processes or expand consciousness, and foods or vegetables, intelligent vegetables that facilitate religious experience when ingested or absorbed in a sacramental context, such as we've known for years and years and years. And I'll end by giving you a vision that I heard about 3 or 4 years ago by a very wise woman, a seeress, who was asked to give a vision of what she saw as the future of psychedelic drugs in our society. And she said that what she saw was that these kinds of plants, she always referred to plants, have been used since the most ancient times all over the world by people to be able to communicate with spirit and to be closer to spirit and to live in a closeness to spirit and nature. And as that has not happened, as they've come away from that and tried to use these plants for other things or in a reckless way, then the plants, the intelligence of the plant itself has withdrawn. That means they become inaccessible. That means, for example, they've become forgotten, like the mushrooms. The sacred mushroom was completely forgotten for 400 years until Wasson and Maria Sabina rediscovered it. The mysteries of Eleusis were completely forgotten. What was the really inherent, the sacred potion that was involved in that was forgotten until Hoffman rediscovered it. And another way that these things become inaccessible is by being made illegal. So if there are people, and I don't know that there'll be ever a large majority of people who will want to use these kinds of plants to expand their consciousness, but those that do will find their way to them and take responsibility for their own health and their own way of life and their own consciousness, and try to live lives that are sane and decent and acknowledge and respect the integrity of all other life forms on this earth. Thank you.
I wish I had some of that stuff. Well, I was surprised to hear McLuhan invoked so many times today, and I will do it again. McLuhan had an idea of what he called the global village, and the global village is coming to be. This is what the crisis that is being presented to us as a crisis in communism is. It isn't a crisis for communism. Communism is going first. But what it is the death knell for centralized structure, for centralized control. If you think what we've been through in the past year is something, wait till you see what's on the agenda. And I don't mean great CNN feed from Moscow as the Soviet Union turns into 15 independent republics. I mean what's going to happen here. What's happening is, as Yeats said in his poem, the center does not hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world, but as fans of chaos, we should know that this mere anarchy is the incarnation of our goddess Discordia, who is going to pull down the honky structure that is oppressing everybody. What I see happening, and it was touched upon by others here, is this intensification of local identification, bioregionalism, awareness of your immediate place, and then no hierarchical structure or identification until you reach the planetary level. I live in Sonoma County, and I am a citizen of Earth. I recognize no intermediate structures except when I have to. So I agree with Tim. I cheer on the people who present the protocols and plead their cases before these gray-faced medical boards. But in my opinion, you just circumvent all that. You go around it. It's irrelevant. History has these dominator types by the balls, and it's not going to let up. You know, history is a psychedelic experience. It's the collective unfolding of the dream of our species in space and time. And we are at the apex. This is the peak. This is the second hour of the trip. We're going over the top.
Well, I'm sorry we've gone too late for questions, but the audience and the speakers will be here. We'll be here for the next hour and a half or so.
Till the sun comes up.
And I'd like to express my appreciation to Elise for helping me coordinate all this.